started out as an academic historian.
Okay.
I did postdoctoral work as an academic historian, and I wasn't thinking about international development or DRR at all in those days. And then I had a spell in the civil service, and then I started looking for jobs with NGOs. And I ended up working for Intermediate Technology from 1990 onwards. They actually hired me to write grant applications and to liaise with funders. So I was fairly well connected with everything the organisation was doing, and they didn't have a DRR program as such in those days, but there was work that you could have branded as DRR if that term had been in use at the time. So they were doing quite a lot of work on food security, for example, and quite a lot of work on housing. So both of those are issues which would fall under the DRR umbrella. And in the sort of mid-90s, it started to emerge as an issue for the organisation as a whole. And that was largely the work of one of our country officers in Peru, where Andrew Mascri was then the head of the office. And of course, he had a history in DRR going back to the 1980s and working with PREDES in Peru and so on. And there was I think a slightly informal decision was made to try and push DRR as an issue a bit more. If you remember, this was the beginning of the UN International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction. So there was generally a higher level of interest, and there was within intermediate technology there was concern that we should at least be able to share our experiences and perspectives on this. So the organisation as a whole kind of took it on, and then there were opportunities for communications people, technical people like myself to get involved in promoting our work and becoming more engaged with other actors in the field to find out what they were doing. It wasn't really a journey with a particular endpoint in mind. It was just something we wanted to develop and work on and expand. So that's how I ended up kind of drifting into it almost.
So was it partly a coincidence, or was it also your interest to move beyond the normal kind of disaster response relief type of work, or what?
It was partly a coincidence. I mean, the timing was very good, but it was also, I was just trying to get more into program work and policy work rather than the more sort of functional administrative stuff I'd been doing. So for me, that was an opportunity. And DRR happened to come along at the right moment. And it was interesting because it was new, quote unquote, and that people hadn't really been thinking about it in that kind of holistic way before. People had been approaching it very much through quite narrow technical specialisms. I wasn't the only person in the organisation who felt that. They saw that as a really important opportunity and a really important issue that an international NGO ought to be addressing.
Well, there are other NGOs in the UK who also kind of embraced the topic quite clearly, because I think you were UK based at that time.
Yes.
You didn't.
Yeah, I was.
You didn't have a country of functional.
No, we had we delegated work to country officers some years before, so they were semi-autonomous really, and they had their own program. As I say, the Peru office was the most active one. There were officers in Kenya and Zimbabwe which were working on food security and had been doing for a very long time. We had an office in Bangladesh, but it wasn't working on disasters just yet, interestingly enough, and one in Sri Lanka, and the Sri Lanka office ended up being the focal point for the South Asian Disaster Network, Duryog Nivaran.
The whole purpose of this exercise is also to find out what were the lessons learned in those early days, which are still relevant up to today. Were there any insights gained in your early career which you have kind of then further developed at a later stage in your career and has still some relevance today?
To be honest, Bruno, I think all the issues that were irrelevant then are relevant now. I mean, other things have appeared since then. I mean, the line we took and which I think was still at that point relatively new, was focusing around community perspectives and community-based action, because that was how intermediate technology had worked previously. And it was about local level empowerment. And I think that was an important thing to push in the 1990s, at least in the UK, because a lot of the disaster actors, if you can call them that, tended to be very technical, particularly from hazard science and engineering backgrounds. And the social and economic perspectives weren't getting promoted very much. So those of us who did have an interest in that, or represented organizations that worked in those areas, were very keen to use the IDNDR as a platform for pushing those out and getting those as part of public debate. So it was a big opportunity to do so.
And the whole work, which you're probably best known for, is the characteristics of a resilient community. When did that kind of start to dawn on you, or when did you find like this is really something, an important piece of work that needs to be developed?
That was much later. That was about sort of 10 years on, really, when that happened. So DRR had moved on quite massively by that point, and a lot of the organizations involved had too, and I had too, because I'd then been working in the field for more than 10 years by the time that came around. That was a commission from a group of NGOs, in fact, to do some work on trying to establish what made communities resilient. And it was, how would I describe it? It was an ongoing conversation, I suppose. I mean, it was a nice project to work on, because it had a kind of output, but it wasn't predetermined what form that output should take. So the idea of turning it into a set of characteristics rather than a blueprint was very deliberate, because it gave choices, it gave options, it gave openings. You can look at the characteristics and use that to analyze a disaster resilient community in your own ways. You don't have to look at every characteristic. It's not rigid in that sense. The idea was it would encourage people to think. And at that stage, lots of NGOs were embracing DRR. They were really excited by it, but they were looking for guidance. And they didn't want the kind of prescriptive guidance that says, yeah, this is the problem, these are the solutions, these are the steps you have to take to do something with it. We wanted actually to hand it much more back to the actors themselves, so that they could make their own informed choices based on a whole range of possibilities. So the characteristics was, in a sense, setting out the whole menu on the table, and you then decide what it is that's important to you and how you're going to go about it. And I think that's why it took off, actually, because it's accessible to anybody.
I mean, in other interviews, we found that 2000, or I mean, the millennium was somehow a moment where, also together with UNISDR, the dynamics of DR really took off. But before that, it was still quite a lonesome business. People seem to have felt quite isolated. I mean, even in the 90s, I mean, IDNDR didn't really get so much traction. Was this also your perspective? I vaguely remember you were in Yokohama yourself with me here.
I wasn't.
You weren't. No. But you were engaged already with some of the NGOs at that time, and they felt quite marginalized in this process. Or
they did very much. The UK experience, I think, is quite an interesting one, because there were NGOs and researchers who were interested, but they didn't have a platform. The only real platform was the UK National Coordination Committee for the IDNDR, because every country had one. And that was pretty old-fashioned, old school, middle-aged white men in suits, actually. And as I said just now, people from very strong technical backgrounds. So it was a bit of a fight to get people on board who had a different perspective, could bring some other understandings and views to the table. Ian Davis was quite important in that, actually, because he was mean, he was a natural person to be on the committee anyway, given his experience and his reputation and what have you. But he was also, I mean, he's always been very inclusive, and he was very keen to get other perspectives, particularly social perspectives and community perspectives, brought on board. So it was Ian who got me onto the IDNDR National Committee in the UK, and Charlie Benson as well, actually, because he wanted those other voices there. Yeah, we felt a bit like pioneers, I think, in the 90s. We were a bit, and pioneers in more than one way. One was actually just trying to get DRR onto the agenda. We didn't even call it DRR in those days. That's another important point. That term didn't appear until around the year 2000, maybe.
So you just used natural disaster reduction, or you used prevention, or what did you?
We didn't use prevention because that was unrealistic. We didn't use natural disaster reduction. Well, we did a bit because that was how the decade had been framed. But we talked about mitigation and preparedness. That was that. So I was actually looking at that the other day when I did that first edition of the DRR Good Practice Guide. I realized I had to put in a subtitle because we recognized at the time that not everybody would understand the term DRR because they didn't use it. So the subtitle was then mitigation and preparedness in disaster, what do we call it? Mitigation and preparedness in development and emergency programming. That's what we called it. So people who were unfamiliar with DRR would get some idea as to what we meant by it. But yeah, it was a new term then, and I think that was actually quite an important shift because yeah, DRR is a bit slippery and it's a bit ambiguous sometimes, and you don't know where it ends. But back then, that was its advantage. It was actually, you know, it was a big tent that lots of people could come into. They, you know, whether you were an engineer, whether you're a hydrologist, whether you're a social scientist, whether you were a campaigner or whatever, you could all come in under that DRR umbrella in a way that I think previous language of disaster management and disaster mitigation hadn't really allowed you to do. So I think that was, in a way, that was probably a big step forward. I don't know how you'd measure that, but it felt like it.
And nowadays, we're not talking systematically anymore about mitigation and preparedness. Mitigation now being much more of a climate term, I think, and then I mean, how do you see the field now? I mean, there's the whole resilience debate of which you know very well. There's the whole debate on climate adaptation being almost the same thing as DRR. Do you think these are positive developments, or these are kind of challenging developments, and it's even more difficult now to get the clear DRR message across, or not?
I think it's positive in the sense that there is space for a lot more people to enter the conversations and get involved, and that's certainly been happening in the last, I would say, the last 20 years. And that's expanded massively at all levels, really. I think that's been good. Yes, I think it's been very confusing. And as you say, there's a lot of overlap, if you like, and I think when resilience came along as well, that was also very confusing for a lot of people because they could see why it was useful to have a concept like resilience and what it could deliver, but there were so many overlaps with other ideas that it was actually quite difficult to untangle. And we have had this situation where there's been a lot of kind of rebranding of different ways of thinking and working as resilience or DRR or whatever you want to call it, but actually they're no different from what they were under another label, you know, 10, 15 years before. I do think we need to be careful about that. But that also partly reflects the way the whole field has expanded. I mean, in terms of the number of organizations and individuals who are involved in it, you know, be it at policy level or programming level or academically. I mean, the field has just mushroomed in the last 20 years, absolutely massively. So when I first got involved, it was actually quite possible to meet a lot of the, you know, the key movers and thinkers in DRI. If you only had to go to 1 or 2 conferences or something like that, and you would meet quite a lot of people, or at least know who they were. Now there are just thousands of them, and it's become an industry in its own right, and that's you know that's quite hard to navigate your way through as well and find out, well, what exactly is the state of play now? You know, is it what the big international organizations are saying? Is it what the latest research is saying that's coming out in the journals? Well, that's a massive output, you know, or is it something else? I'm not quite sure where we are now.
And the number of people have dramatically increased. Has the impact of their work also dramatically increased? Would you say that this planet is now safer than 30 years ago, thanks to all their work? Or is it just like a superstructure that has been created with lots of meetings, conferences, documents being produced, but the impact at the community level still is rather limited, or it could be improved?
Definitely. I mean, you know, we talk it up a lot, and you know, sort of theoretically and in terms of policy and program design, we've moved on massively, and there's a lot more investment in it and a lot more understanding of it. But you know, the problem's huge. I think that's the key bit. On the ground, I don't know necessarily what does change, and I think we forget the structural issues as well. You know, just, you know, DRR is a public good in a sense. There's nothing not to like about DRR. It's very important, you know. But if the institutions of development and aid haven't really changed in some ways. You still have to navigate all of that stuff. And the you know, problems getting bigger. You know, the issues that are arising from climate change are now so acute and so vast that I'm not sure the conventional talk about action about DRR is necessarily the way to deal with it. It becomes a much more almost existential issue rather than just a humanitarian one.
Was climate change already on the radar screen in those early days, or was it still something to take into consideration for the next generations? Or
I don't know. I can't remember. Back in the early 90s, I don't think it was particularly. I think by the beginning of the 2000s, it certainly was, because I remember talking to people who were working on one of the early IPCC reports. So it was there, but I don't think anybody really quite saw, in a sense, how rapidly the problem would grow. You know. I still think policymakers are playing catch up there.
Okay, maybe a last question about who were your main influences, or the people? I mean, you mentioned Ian Davies already. Who were the ones that you kind of had as a role model for your own work, or
as an influence? Well, Ian definitely, and I guess people I was working with a lot of the time. So Charlie Benson would be one, because we did quite a lot of work together, as you'll remember, in the early 2000s. A lot of people in NGOs. I was doing a lot of work for NGOs at the time, so you learn a lot from that. I did work for Oxfam and ActionAid and CAFOD and CARE. I can't remember. So you get to meet a kind of pool of people who are thinking more or less the same way. So not individuals. Intellectually is another matter, I think, because there are really quite different strands of disaster thinking, you know, which to some extent are based on geography. So, you know, American discourse on disasters has lots of overlaps with what's going on amongst agencies working in you know, lower income countries and so on in the global south. But in a way, they come from different traditions, and I think that's also quite interesting. Intellectually, the field has also sort of expanded in so many different ways that you have to think quite hard about where you're really positioning yourself. Yeah.
Well, you've certainly been an influencer to a lot of younger generation people yourself. So I think
that's always what I don't know about trying to influence younger people. I mean, my aim has always been to try and not to change policy so much, because that's a big effort, and you need some quite heavyweight institutions to get involved in that, I think. But to change practice or to improve practice. So if you look at the stuff I've I've written, like the characteristics of a disaster resilient community, like the DRR good practice review, like lots of other papers, working papers and what have you. That's always been my aim. It's actually to help people improve their practice and the way they work, but not in a directive way. You know, just to give them the tools to do the job better. And I think the NGO sector has been really innovative and active in that, I think.
In another interview, people were saying it's hard to convey a message that you have, I mean, come to realize in your career to a next generation, because they all want somehow to reinvent the wheel or promote their own perspective, even by challenging what former generations have written or have told them to do. Is that a big challenge? I mean, and especially, I mean, the example was given about the use of natural disasters and so on. Apparently now it's again a common term, and while I thought it was generally accepted that this should be a term no longer used. So apparently people do not seem to listen very carefully to messages from the past, and they want to kind of start their own careers by building up their own insights. Is this also your view, or do you feel like people are really hungry to learn from what you've learned in your own life?
I think they just don't think about it. I think actually, we all always work in the present, I suppose, largely. It's only when you've been around a while you can start to see, I think, trends. So I do think there's, I mean, that's why I think there's a case for writing, you know, histories of DRR and what have you, so that people, in a sense, know where they've come from. And I think that's useful. And I don't think it necessarily needs to be a big deal, but I do think people need to be aware of that. When I first started at Intermediate Technology, there were lots of us who were quite young and were coming in with new ideas and all the rest of it. And there were always senior people in the room who were saying, oh no, we did that in 1975 or something like that, and it didn't, etc., etc. And I thought at the time, I do not want to be that person when I get older. And I've tried very hard not to be that person, but it's actually quite difficult to do so, because sometimes you hear lots of enthusiastic ideas and you think, no, we've tried that. It's not going to work. It's not going to work. It's naive. But you have to bite your tongue sometimes, because you need that energy and impetus to move things forward. And yeah, you don't hit your target every time, do you? I mean, sometimes you go off course.
Okay. Now, I think these interviews, especially if we have like quite a critical mass of interviews, it will help the next generation of DRR practitioners and researchers to at least understand what your and other thoughts were, and hopefully this will also influence their work. Thanks a lot, John, for the interview.